So as Eve said, I worked at the Sun and Province for 25 years. I did research for reporters and worked on special projects and books. I also taught technology and a number of other things, as well as taking care of the very large photo collection at the Vancouver Sun and Province. I was hired in 1990 to create a computer database for the negatives collection. Up until that time, the library took care of the photographs and the hard copy photos, but the negatives were managed by people in the newsrooms. On the Sun side, they had one person do them for a period of many years, and so it was consistent, if a bit odd. And on the Province side, it was done by people working at night, copy runners, just anybody, any old person. So it's pretty idiosyncratic. So I was hired to create this computer database. At the time, there were 12 or so photographers working for both the Sun and at the Province. And they were shooting roughly 4,000 photo assignments every year, representing about 10,000 rolls of film per side. You just see the volume. It was just unbelievable, covering everything from news, business, sports, entertainment, what have you. So the data entry for this computer database was kind of overwhelming for the staff there, although at that time the press library had about 20 people, including a library manager and an assistant manager. These days there is one librarian. So in 2012, it was the 100th anniversary of the Vancouver Sun, and I worked with Shelley Freilich on a book called Making Headlines, which was a history of the Vancouver Sun. We had a publisher and everything, and then that fell through because the publisher went out of business. And the book was already pretty much done, so we self-published the book. It did very well and won a BC Book Prize. And on the strength of that, we were contacted by Greystone Books, a local publisher. They wanted to see if we could come up with some books using the photos in the Sun and Province collection. And the first book we did together was Vancouver in the 70s. And when I was researching that book, there were so many protest demonstrations in the 1970s on so many subjects. So I thought, I could do a whole book on protests. I proposed that to Greystone, and they went with that idea, and instead of obviously not just the 70s, covering a century of Vancouver protests, riots, and strikes. So I thought I'd show you just a bit about the PNG photo collection and the photography at the Sun, just before I get going. This is the press library in 1937 at the old Sun Tower at 500 Beatty Street. At that time, the collection was newspaper clippings and what were called cuts, which were metal engravings of images. By 1945, it looked a little bit more together there at the Sun Tower. And there weren't Sun or Province staff photographers until the late 30s. Prior to that, in the newspaper, first of all, there weren't that many photographs published in the newspaper, and those that were mostly from wire service photographs about politics, war, sports, and such. So local photographs were shot by studio photographers who had their own equipment and the ability to publish it, and they sold it to the newspapers. Later in the 30s, you start to see Sun cameraman or Province photographer under the photos, and then eventually, finally, their names under the photo. My favorite being Province photographer Huxley Lovely. And this in 1948, the Vancouver Sun by then had several photographers, as did the Province, and then they got this brand new big photography lab and all this equipment. So this is in 1948 of the state-of-the-art photography department that they now had. This is a bunch of Sun photographers with Elsie Duncan, who was the photo assistant, who featured in many set-up photos over the years. And this is at a Christmas party at the Sun Tower. This is a bit hard to see. This is how the negatives were indexed. And this one from the 1980s on card files, this one for protest and demonstrations. So basically the photo assistant would write a one-sentence description of the assignment, photo assignment, which could represent one roll of film or four, or whatever, the last name of the photographer and the finding number. Here's my favorite province index card, including new curbs on Belmont, misspelled. And of course, there is a subject heading for streets, but instead it went under bugger if I know. There's also a large card in files called miscellaneous. This is an example of a photo negative envelope from the 70s, this one by George Dyack. The people take over the Georgia Strait. We are the people. Who are the people? Power to the people, far out. And you'd have to know George Dyack is like the straightest man alive. And of course, I thought you'd want to see the photo. And here it is. This was a protest. I read about it in the recent Georgia Strait book. Paul Watson talks about a protest by staff members who wanted owner Dan McLeod to give up ownership of the paper and have it run as a cooperative. It failed. This is an example of a card which indicates subject headings for subject files. This for Stanley Park. And for many, many years, I tried to get some library school student from UBC to make this into a computerized thesaurus and never had any takers for some strange reason. It includes Four Seasons Hotel, All Seasons Park, hidden and buried in there. That was in 1971, a protest site for over a year against the building of the Four Seasons Hotel at the entrance to Stanley Park. Some photos on the back have what's called the cut line, which is a caption, the name of the photographer, and a stamp of the date that it ran. If you find such a picture, it has a wealth of information. But many of the early pictures that I found in the Sun and Province files had absolutely nothing on the back. So they required quite a bit of work to find out when this event happened, what it was about, and a lot of hours of looking at microfilm. Here I am with my valid try to put the 4,000 photo assignments into the computer database with help. And then in 1995, the Sun and Province became the first newspapers in North America to go all digital. So after that, there was a digital image archive. So when I was researching this book, I first went to some of the sites. This is Major Matthews' list of riots and strikes. He had put together, he said, I'm home today, sick, but off the top of his head, he just sent these in, apparently. An interesting one at the end was the Zoot Suit riot with young men supposed to be avoiding war service who were warring with merchant sailors in town. This is a Sun index card for riots, and that Zoot Suiters riot is mentioned at the top too. Zoot Suiters in a riot, it's crossed out with the red in 1944. And also, interestingly, a riot at the Girls Industrial School on Cassiar Street in 1948, soldiers warring with Zoot Suiters at the Lux Cafe, and also Crescent Beach, scene of hoodlum riot. I didn't find everything, obviously, that is on the cards, frustratingly. That's why it's so remarkable that there are 3 photographs in 1907 on the front page of the Province after the anti-Asian riot. This was after a meeting of the Asiatic Exclusion League. There was a racist rampage through Chinatown and Japantown. And so obviously this was shot by a local photographer. I never found the images, but I found similar ones in the collection of the Vancouver City Archives and the special collections at the Vancouver Public Library. There were also a lot of other images that I wasn't able to find. For instance, this was a protest by a war widow who had been evicted from her home. I also looked for pictures of suffragettes, and although there were many, many articles in the paper about the suffragette movement, I unfortunately could never find any photographs. Once I did find all the photographs that I wanted and could find, I knew that the earlier years would be the problem for the reasons that I outlined, but that later years there would just be too many. It was the other flip side of that. I thought about kind of the themes that came from the photos that I was finding. So some of the themes that were consistent over time were government, mostly anti-government protests, but there were pro-government ones as well, social justice issues, the evolution of the peace movement, Indigenous activism, labor strikes, the environmental movement, protests by youth and students and children, hooliganism and riots, and then later I found more on housing, development, and heritage. This is May Day has been celebrated in Vancouver for over 100 years. This is a 1937 International Workers' Day, as it was known, or May Day, parade on Georgia Street. And you can see the protest by workers at the White Lunch restaurant, which they did win that strike after customers would not cross picket lines. Another theme that runs through the photos is the many times that Vancouverites have felt the need to travel to Ottawa to have their grievances heard. In 1907, Chief Joe Capilano, who's here with the blanket over his arm, and a delegation of chiefs, headed to Ottawa to speak with Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier. Then they carried on to London, England, to speak with King Edward VII and all about land claims. I read somewhere that at the time they were told it was a difficult issue and they might have to be patient. In 1970, the Vancouver Women's Caucus organized the Abortion Caravan, which was a convoy of vehicles that headed to Ottawa to protest the new abortion law. And in 1986, folks from Lyle Island went to Ottawa to protest the logging in Haida Gwaii. These are just a few examples of the many instances. The other thing I found was that the Vancouver Courthouse, now the Vancouver Art Gallery, has long been the protest site for the city. Vancouver City Hall used to be located on Main Street, south of where Carnegie Centre is now. And in 1937, it moved to its current location at 12th and Cambie. That was a long way away from downtown. So there were other downtown sites that were protest sites. And interestingly, the North Plaza of the Vancouver Art Gallery was recently being renovated. And when they asked for public opinion of what people wanted in that North Plaza, overwhelmingly, rather than say green space in the middle of the city, people voted to have it retained as an open plaza, and that's what has happened. Other sites around town are the Powell Street grounds, now Oppenheimer Park, the Cambie Street grounds, which is Larwill Park, the former site of the bus depot across from the Beatty Armory, which is now a parking lot. Vancouver City Hall has long been a protest site, Victory Square, and Stanley Park, especially Malkin Bowl and Lumberman's Arch. Another thing I discovered that Vancouver's often been at the vanguard of protest activism. This is Greenpeace, which originated here in Vancouver. And in 1971, their first big campaign was to head up to Amchitka Island off Alaska to protest the US 5-megaton nuclear test. They headed off, they hired this Phyllis Cormack and headed up the coast. They, of course, got nowhere near that. They were turned back by the Coast Guard and the Navy and such. And when they returned to Vancouver, they felt that it was a real failure. But when they came home, they realized that their actions had garnered worldwide support. And in a way, it made their name and go on to the organization worldwide organization it is today. While they were up in or trying to get to Amchitka, 22 lower mainland high schools allowed their students out for the day to go and protest in downtown Vancouver, and 10,000 students gathered in the city to protest against Amchitka, one of several protests against Amchitka that fall. Years later, when Bob Hunter, who was on the Phyllis Cormack in that campaign, was asked why Greenpeace developed here in Vancouver, of all places, he said that Vancouver had the biggest concentration of tree huggers, radicalized students, garbage dump stoppers, shit-disturbing unionists, freeway fighters, pot smokers, aging Trotskyites, condo killers, farmland savers, fish preservationists, animal rights activists, back-to-the-landers, vegetarians, nudists, Buddhists, and anti-spraying, anti-pollution marchers and picketers in the country and per capita in the world. So the photos I'm going to show you next is kind of an overview of photos from City on Edge, organized chronologically, and they cover the themes that I mentioned before, with an extended look at some events in the 1930s and in the 1970s. This is the Steveston salmon strike in 1900. Salmon fishermen, who were a mix of Caucasian, Japanese, and First Nations fishermen, they were demanding 25 cents per fish. The cannery felt that the crowds could get out of control and called in the Duke of Connaught's own rifles to keep the order, and in the end, the fishermen settled on 19 cents per fish. In 1912, there were protests for free speech after the City of Vancouver banned public meetings. What they were attempting to do, a lot of these meetings were organized by the International Workers of the World, who came up from the US and tried to organize in logging camps and other resource industries. And anyway, after many people, 24 were arrested at this demonstration, and at others, they disbanded the band, I guess. In 1914, the Komagata Maru arrived in Vancouver with 376 passengers hoping to immigrate to Canada. Gurdit Singh, who's in the white at the top there, he was intentionally challenging Canada's exclusionary immigration policy towards Asians. Only a few people were allowed to disembark, otherwise they were forced to stay on the ship for 2 months before being ordered to leave under armed escort. At the time, Gurdit Singh said, "We are British citizens and we consider we have the right to visit any part of the empire. We are determined to make this a test case, and if we are refused entrance to your country, the matter will not end there." In 1922, students at UBC organized a demonstration. Basically, their goal was to have the buildings at the West Point Grey campus finished. Construction had been halted during the First World War. So they organized what was called the Great Trek from downtown Vancouver and gathered here in the unfinished science building out at the West Point Grey campus. In the 1930s, it was a really tough time in Vancouver, and during the Depression. There were men called relief camp men who were single unemployed men, and they went to relief camps where they made 20 cents a day, doing, at logging camps. They build roads and other infrastructure, but conditions were really, really poor in the camps, and they converged on Vancouver in 1930 many times, but this time in 1935. At first, they occupied the Hudson Bay store for some reason, where they chanted work and wages before they were driven out and 9 men were arrested. Then they made their way to Victory Square, and Mayor Jerry McGeer stood in front of the cenotaph and ordered the protesters to disperse. When they didn't, apparently he shouted, "Okay, boys, you asked for it, and here it is," and read the riot act. There was huge support for the relief camp men. This was a big gathering called the Women's Strike. 2,000 women mustered at the Cambie Street grounds and marched to the Denman Arena, where a crowd of 16,000 people went to raise money and talk about what they could be done for the relief camp men. And this was the May Day celebration at Malkin Bowl in that year, in 1935, where somewhere like 10,000 people gathered. Interestingly, there were floats of Mayor McGeer reading the Riot Act as part of the, so. And this is a gathering an organization called the Vancouver Mothers Council. This was on Mother's Day, and they formed the shape of a heart with relief camp men. And once again, this organization was involved in trying to get food and resources, fighting City Hall and such on behalf of the relief camp men. Some of the men occupied the Public Library and City Museum, now Carnegie Center, and this is them hoisting up baskets with coffee and baked goods. Finally, in June of that year, they a number of men boarded boxcars to head to Ottawa to try to have their grievances heard. This is a big longshoreman strike that year as well at Ballantyne Pier. It turned into what was called the Battle of Ballantyne Pier after police were trying to prevent striking workers from boarding ships where strikebreakers were loading. Then in 1938, again, 1,200 men marched into downtown Vancouver and occupied 3 buildings. The Vancouver Art Gallery, which was located further west on Georgia Street then, the post office, now Sinclair Center, federal building, and the Hotel Georgia. Interestingly, in the exhibition, City on Edge, there's a little newspaper that was produced called the Sit-Downer Gazette. So they actually had their own newspaper during the occupation. I'll just read you, as I said, there was wide-scale support for these men. I'll just read you an editorial in The Sun, notoriously right-wing, but in this case, in their favor. When homeless, unemployed men occupied the Hotel Georgia, the Art Gallery, and Post Office, they garnered public support for their plight. This is the editorial in The Sun. Since last Friday, certain public and semi-public buildings of Vancouver have been invaded and occupied by a host of unemployed men who have drifted into Vancouver from many Canadian points. This invasion and this occupation were not unforeseen. Ever since the forestry camps closed and jobless men, disinherited by the federal government whose responsibility they are, commenced to gather in the city, it's been plain that unless Ottawa awakened to its obvious duty, some sort of lawlessness was bound to ensue. So far, these men have exhibited amazing restraint. They have demonstrated, of course, a deep contempt for government, and their actions have given Vancouver much unfavorable publicity throughout the continent. But the contempt for government they have exhibited is not very much greater than that felt by the average citizen. What the foreign news services and foreign broadcasting stations have been saying about this situation is not very much stronger than what Vancouver people have themselves been saying about Ottawa. Shortly after they occupied the Hotel Georgia, they were offered $500 in relief money and voted to take it to share and left. There was a huge gathering of about 4,000 also in their favor at Oppenheimer Park. And then on June 19th, the last people occupying was at the post office, and the RCMP and city police used truncheons and tear gas to oust the men from the post office after 30 days. Steve Brody was the organizer, the leader of the sit-downers, as they were called, and he was injured and sent to St. Paul Hospital. Afterwards, a gathering was at the Vancouver Police Department, And Harold Winch, CCF member of the provincial legislature, urged the crowd to remain calm, remarking, "We've had one riot in Vancouver today, don't let's have another." And then later that evening, there was a gathering of several thousand in support and against police brutality. This is in 1942. The building is called the Immigration Building, and there were Japanese men held there, and they rioted the night before, and because they didn't want to go to the internment camps without their families. This photo ran on the front page of the province, and I looked everywhere for it, and I finally found it in the collection of the Toronto Star. These are Doukhobors who protested in a 6-hour vigil at the Vancouver courthouse to demand the release of 13 of their brethren from Ocala prison in 1944. In 1946, there was a very bitter Vancouver province newspaper strike. The company still produced the newspapers and were trying to distribute them when strikers and their supporters overturned trucks and threw the newspapers around. At that time, the Vancouver province was the #1 newspaper in the city, and because of the bitter feelings over the strike, many people would not subscribe after, and they never retained their #1 position. In 1946, returning veterans from the Second World War came back to Vancouver to find a severe housing crisis. They occupied the empty and Hotel Vancouver that was slated for demolition. And as a result of their actions, the old hotel was turned into a hostel for a period of 2 years, where families such as this moved into hotel rooms there. This is a early anti-development protest. This for Fraserview housing development. The government had expropriated the property, which had been a cherry orchard, and several holdouts objected to the land price being offered and the method used to divide the land. This is in 1949. This is the first Grey Cup riot in 1955. As I mentioned before, in the 40s there were Zoot Suit gangs. In the 50s there were park gangs and Halloween riots on a regular basis. In 1955, Vancouver hosted the Grey Cup for the very first time, and afterwards there was a huge riot. And there was also a riot in 1958 and 1966. So for some folks that feel like the 1994 Stanley Cup riot was the first sports riot, we have a long history of sports and concert riots here in the city. This is a 1958 protest against segregation after a biracial couple from Seattle was evicted from a downtown hotel. Vancouver's always had a very strong anti-war movement. This in 1963 is a small gathering of people at Victory Square. You can see on the left the peace sign. The peace sign was developed in Britain in 1958 by a graphic designer who designed the symbol for the nuclear disarmament movement there, and it was quickly adopted all over the world. Indigenous people were not allowed to protest until the 1950s. This is an early blockade in 1967 by a man, in 1964 actually, by a Squamish man. The CNR work crew had come to rebuild track through North Vancouver's Mission Reserve. This is a 1968 protest or a gathering at UBC with Yippie leader Jerry Rubin, who came to speak to students. In his speech, he talked about the need for personal freedom, and afterwards, a number of students occupied the faculty club at UBC, where they smoked pot, drank all the beer, and swam naked in the swimming pool. Also at SFU in 1968, there'd been big protests at Simon Fraser University in 1965 and 1967, but the biggest one was in 1968 when 114 students were arrested. Some of the causes that they were fighting for were, they wanted more chance to be part of the governance of the university and also better access to their student records. By the end of the 1960s, the peace movement had grown hugely in Vancouver, especially from the influx of draft dodgers and deserters who had left the US to avoid the Vietnam War. This is a big anti-Vietnam protest at the courthouse, and this is Member of Parliament Grace MacInnes speaking to the crowd. Grace MacInnes was the first woman from BC to become an MP. Then in 1970, there was an organization called the Vancouver Liberation Front, and this is them protesting at a city hall meeting. Some of the placards are hilarious. Free food from the supermarket chains, right? Anyway, at the time, our mayor was Tom Campbell, and he really didn't like hippies and transient youth in the city. Here's what he had to say at the time to the CBC. When he was asked what thought should be done about the hippies, he replied, "Personally, I'd just as soon they leave town. They want all the rights and to contribute nothing. Think what would happen in our country continued this way. Within the next 2 generations, there wouldn't be a country. If these young people do get their way, they will destroy Canada, and from what I hear across the world, they will destroy the world." One of his tactics was to purchase riot gear for the Vancouver Police Department. This was hotly debated in City Council, but it went through. There was also protests against buying the riot gear. But buy the riot gear they did and put to very good use over the next 2 or 3 years. The first was shortly afterwards. There were 3 English Bay riots, which were after the Sea Festival, and many people were injured. It was a big set-to. This is in October 1970. There had been transient youth who were staying at the Beatty Armory, and they got kicked out of there, so they occupied the empty Jericho Armed Forces base, and then on this day, on October 15th, they got turfed out of there as well. At the time, Pierre Trudeau had enacted the War Measures Act to deal with the FLQ uprising in Quebec. But Tom Campbell thought he might be able to use the War Measures Act in Vancouver. So he told the Vancouver Sun on October 17th, "I think we'd use it for people trying subversive undertakings, for people advocating the overthrow of government. Campbell said the act could apply in Vancouver to the Vancouver Liberation Front, to some of the yippie groups and Maoists, against drug pushers and draft dodgers." That kind of culminated in the infamous Gastown riot in 1971, where there was a pro-pot gathering in Maple Tree Square. The police were sent in, were rather heavy-handed in their crowd control. As a result, there was an inquiry called the Dome Inquiry, and it did result in them feeling that the police had been overzealous. Here's some of the 38 people who were charged at the Gastown riot. And the next day, there was a protest against police brutality at the police station. Also in the 1970s was a real rise of social justice issues for rights of women. This is the very first Gay Alliance Towards Equality gathering at the courthouse in 1971 with just a dozen people at that point. protests by First Nations people, especially in light of actions in the US by the American Indian movement. Here's a demonstration by disabled folks who were trying to get better transit. In the 1980s, there was a real rise in ethnic activism. This was by the Lower Mainland East Indian Taxi Drivers Association. They were protesting alleged racism by yellow cabs. Here, Ku Klux Klan protesting communism on Hastings Street in 1982. I always find this so shocking that in the 1980s, In 1983, there was a solidarity movement over several months. It was a protest against the BC provincial government's restraint budget, and it was the largest anti-government protest in BC history. During the many protests that year, there was a big gathering at Empire Stadium of 40,000 people, including this person whose sign says, "Cutbacks are needed." I tried as much as I could, both in the book and in the exhibition, to have many sides of the issues. In the 1980s, there was a big move towards anti-pornography, and this is a protest at Red Hot Video. There was also an organizations called the Direct Action and the Women's Fire Brigade. They felt that regular protest demonstrations were no longer effective, and what was required was direct action. Some of the people from these groups ended up becoming what were called the Vancouver Five or the Squamish Five. Some of them were arrested for bombing of Lytton Industries outside Toronto and of several Red Hot Video outlets around the Lower Mainland. And this is a protest in favor of Ann Hansen, one of the Vancouver Five, Squamish Five. Another big issue in the 80s was street sex workers, and mostly in the West End and in Mount Pleasant. Shame the Johns was a big movement then. And in the 1980s were the annual peace marches. They were huge marches of 60,000, 80,000, sometimes 100,000 people from all walks of life on an annual basis. In 1989, there were several large protests in Vancouver and area about in support of the pro-democracy movement after students were killed at Tiananmen Square. In 1993, there was a blockade of the Kennedy Lake Road into Clayoquot Sound on Vancouver Island. There were also really huge protests in Vancouver at the courthouse, at the Vancouver Art Gallery and in front of the McBill and Bloedel building. Over the course of that summer, there were more than 800 people arrested, 80% of them women, and it was the largest act of civil disobedience in Canadian history. Protests started to get a little more violent in the 1990s. This was during the meeting of the Asia Pacific Economic Conference, APEC, at the Museum of Anthropology at UBC. And students and other protesters tried to get closer to the leaders, and some of them were pepper sprayed, the infamous Sergeant Pepper episode. The next year, there was what was called the Riot at the Hyatt, and these were protesters who rallied outside the Hyatt Regency Hotel when Jean Chrétien was speaking at a Liberal fundraiser. In 2002, there was a 90-day direct action occupation of the Woodward's department store, the empty Woodward's department store, to draw attention to affordable housing and homelessness. And there were many, many peace protests over the years. This one in 2003, when people gathered at the art gallery, the same day that the United States fired its first cruise missiles at Iraq to start the Gulf War. As I say, May Day has been celebrated for over a century. This is a large gathering in 2004. In 2011, there was a second Stanley Cup riot after the Canucks lost to the Boston Bruins. And later that year, there was Occupy Vancouver. Occupy Vancouver was part of a global movement, Occupy Wall Street, and people occupied the North Plaza of the Vancouver Art Gallery for 6 weeks. And the focus of the protest was sort of against corporate greed, unemployment, and government inaction. In 2014, there was BC's longest teacher strike, which saw kids out of school for 5 weeks. And there are many, many protests on an ongoing basis in our multicultural city by different ethnic groups protesting conditions and issues in their home countries. This is a candlelight vigil in Surrey for a student who was raped and murdered in Delhi. There was kind of a lull in big protests in the city during a period which many people were signing online petitions, kind of can be called clicktivism, and it wasn't until 2016 there was a big protest of 5,000 people against the proposed expansion of the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline. It was the first really large gathering in some time. And then in 2017, 15,000 people attended the Women's March in conjunction with the Women's March on Washington, the day after the inauguration of US President Donald Trump. So as I wrote in my essay for the book, protesting is in Vancouver's DNA. Vancouver's protest culture, born from our rebellious and turbulent history, is bred into our city's blood. Our citizens' passionate engagement with a wide range of social and political issues, from hyperlocal to global, cannot be denied. And while a simmering opposition to authority in the city of extremes can take us to the edge and sometimes over, at the heart of our city's culture of resistance is the utopian ideal of social order and peace and the desire for community belonging. It is this optimistic idealism that drives Vancouverites to continually show up, step up, and seek a better path, a better world in our own fiercely independent West Coast way.